of on Macbeth. So now I'm hoping that you had a chance to get the little outline that I sent earlier this morning. It's just a kind of brief overview. We're going to get through the very kind of preliminary stuff, the first two acts of Macbeth. But I think this should set us up for lots of discussion about Macbeth. I also want to mention, as far as Macbeth goes, so there was this assignment that I had originally intended to have you guys do, and I've taken that off the syllabus. I'm giving everybody the maximum credit for that. I'm going to post an example of that. I'm still working on kind of getting it in a good form, but I'm going to post an example of that in the next couple of days, just so you can see what I was expecting you to do. And the article that I'm going to have, if you want to take a look at the article and you want to look at how I responded to it, is an article about the way time seems to work in Macbeth. So a couple of things I'm going to say today will have things to say about time as well. Okay, just turn to my notes here. Some coffee. Okay, so far this semester we have looked at plays. I've arranged our class not chronologically, but by genre, right? So we started by looking at a couple of comedies. We looked at two English history plays. And then for the last part of the semester, we're going to be looking at tragedies. And if we had had more, if things had not gotten all janky, then we would have also looked at a romance, The Tempest. But I've taken The Tempest off of our syllabus. So we're just going to end the semester looking at two tragedies. We're going to look at Macbeth, and then we're going to look at King Lear. And one thing that might be interesting to think about, and I'll probably have a final exam question that'll address this, would be to think about comparing how the tragic aspects of those two plays compares to each other. Thinking about comparing these two tragedies is, I think, a pretty likely sort of topic for the final exam. So first thing I want to do is just to talk a little bit about the genre of tragedy. So a tragedy is, in the simplest terms, you could say a tragedy has a lot of death and gore and a kind of sad ending to it. The kind of the great classic theorist of all this stuff, right? Going back to Aristotle. Aristotle has a whole section discussing tragedy in his aesthetics, in his poetics. And the idea, and you might ask yourself this question: why would you want to go and witness a tragic spectacle? Why would you go to a theater and watch something tragic? So first, just really quickly, the origins of tragedy, as Aristotle outlines them, come from a kind of sacrificial notion. So Aristotle's writing in Athens in the 4th century BCE, the 300s before Christ, kind of thing, and tragedy had taken on kind of a pretty significant and sophisticated form in classical Greece. I'm not sure if any of you in any of your other classes might have read, say, Aeschylus or Sophocles, Euripides, these kind of great dramatic figures that we have that have come down to us from ancient Greece. But tragedy has its origins, as far as the Athenians are concerned, in a festival, right? So it's a kind of celebratory aspect of things, but also with a sacrificial aspect to it. So, back when they used to do blood sacrifice as a thing in ancient cultures, there was, a kind of a tragic sacrifice, the sacrifice of a scapegoat, basically, in ancient Greek festivals. And tragedy basically kind of grew up, at least in Aristotle's kind of story of how tragedy develops, but that tragedy grows up around that sacrificial moment. And then, it takes on, it develops over decades and, a century. And by the time Aristotle is getting to talking about tragedy, there's actually a theatrical festival in Athens where there is a kind of competition for the greatest tragedy written that year, kind of thing. And so different, essentially kind of different guilds or different families, they would, put together a series of sad, basically, that's what tragedy, you can think of tragedy as having kind of sad quality to it, of sort of sad plays. And then there would be a kind of dramatic competition, right? They would stage their plays, and then there was an audience and a judging panel, and they would sort of decide, which was the greatest tragedy performed that year. Anyway, and so when Aristotle is trying to figure out, like, well, why do people go to? I mean, like, tragedies are sad, right? And here we are, we're in the midst of this epidemic, and ancient Greece, for instance, kept having plague problems and epidemics of various kinds, and why would you? We got enough tragedy going on in our everyday lives. Why do you want to go and witness a spectacle that we think of as tragic? And so Aristotle's understanding of this is there are a couple things that are important about it. One, for Aristotle, the main thing why we go to tragedy has to do with the way that our emotions and our passions are manipulated or affected by the experience of watching a play. I've mentioned before that in Elizabethan, in Shakespeare's England, there's a guy called Sir Philip Sidney. He has a whole kind of view of this. There's this debate between the pro-theater and the anti-theatrical, the puritanical, religious types, and so on. They both recognize, right? Both the good and the bad recognize the idea that theater has the ability to move us, to affect us, to change our emotions and our points of view, and so on. Anyway, going back to Aristotle, Aristotle's idea is that there is some satisfaction, some pleasure that we derive from, like, sort of having our emotions brought to a high pitch and then released, right? And that's the aspect of catastrophe in the way that Aristotle thinks about tragedy. And so that release of emotion at the end of the tragedy, partly in a sense of, well, at least this didn't happen to me, right? That's part of why we why we might witness a tragedy, pay to see a tragedy, that kind of thing. That basically the work that it does to our emotions. There are a couple other aspects. I just want to mention a couple other aspects about tragic form. One of them is, well, a couple things. So first, in Aristotle, and really all the way through Shakespeare's period, the notion of tragedy, it's a little bit different than, say, like the way a 21st century newscaster might use the term tragedy, right? They might say there was a tragic car accident on I-10 or something like that. Aristotle would not have recognized a car accident on I-10 as a tragedy. I mean, that would have just been a really terrible, unfortunate episode or whatever, but it wouldn't have been tragic from Aristotle's point of view. Tragedy has to deal with the events around a great person, particularly a great man, and so tragedies tend to involve kings, generals, dukes, big important leaders of various kinds, and the idea of like, say, a craftsman or something like that, right? The guy who shoes horse, blacksmith or something like that would not be involved in a tragedy in Aristotle's point of view. And so, of course, Macbeth, right, is a tragedy about a duke, a thane, who's on his way to becoming and does eventually become king. Okay, so that's the first thing, right? Is that well, that's the second thing, I suppose. The second thing is it has to involve someone of a particular kind of elite social status, and then also important in the theory of tragedy that Aristotle lays out is an idea of, the technical term that he uses is anagnoresis, which is a kind of a moment of recognition. Aristotle recognized that, or he would suggest that it can't be a tragedy if it's just some terrible death that happens to a person of elite status or whatever. That they have to recognize that they have made a wrong choice and that the consequences that they're suffering are part of a tragedy, right? That they have brought this on themselves in some way and that they're responsible for the tragic action. And the classic example, right, is to look back at Oedipus, right? So for Aristotle, Oedipus Rex is kind of the pinnacle of tragic form, and so he looks at what happens with Oedipus Rex as a way of kind of tracking things like anagnorisis and that kind of thing. And also, you sometimes, I mean, in your high school classes, maybe you might have seen this term thrown around, and certainly Aristotle uses it as well, as the idea of hubris, right? The idea of not just pride, but a kind of arrogant defiance of social norms and that kind of thing, which creates what is sometimes called a tragic flaw, right? But a kind of a blind spot, a lack of awareness on the part of the tragic protagonist. Okay, so that's just a little bit of background. I want to mention a couple other kind of background issues here. There's a particular kind of tragedy that we're watching here with Macbeth, and it's called the term had kind of developed in medieval Europe of what's called a decasibus. It's two words, it's Latin, D-E and then C-A-S-I-B-U-S, decasibus tragedy. And it's basically kind of tracking an individual's rise and fall, right? A kind of trajectory of one individual. And when we look at King Lear is not a decasibus tragedy, right? There's a lot of other kind of stuff that's going on with Lear, but with Macbeth, it really is sort of just tracking one guy's rise and fall. And Shakespeare inherits this from the dramatists who had gone before him and from some of his sources. The Elizabethans really, there was a text, I've alluded to it once before, called The Mirror for Magistrates, which Shakespeare used, at least in part, for his Richard II, or at least was familiar with from Richard II. And that was a very influential text that has a series of decasibus tragedies, right? Here's one individual, what brings him to a pinnacle and then what brings him low, kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing we're seeing here with Macbeth. I didn't know where to put these last couple of comments. I'm just going to throw them in here now. So it's worth, Macbeth is it's a play that has a lot of supernatural stuff to it, like ghosts and witches and apparitions and visions and that sort of thing. There's a demon in it. I mean, there's all kinds of kind of scary, spooky stuff. You remember my friend, colleague Jay, who came in the first week of our semester. He has written a kind of for Halloween. He puts on these kind of pastiche of Shakespeare bits called Bloody Shakespeare, or Shakespeare in the Asylum was the one he did last fall, and he has to draw a ton of stuff out of Macbeth because Macbeth is full of bloodshed, ghosts, witches. I mean, it's a very sort of Halloween-y kind of play. And then another way of kind of, just to give you a kind of a modern analog or something you could kind of feel like this play might resemble, is that it has a lot of resonances with, say, like modern mobster films, like Al Capone kind of story and that kind of thing. Because like basically what happens is once the kind of the kingpin gets knocked off, then there's this whole series of bloodshed and recrimination, and once you're kind of start killing people, you kind of can't stop it, sort of thing. And so in fact, Macbeth itself has been adapted, like when modern directors are thinking about like how do I want to put on my Macbeth, they'll sometimes put him in like zoot suits and big hats and driving whatever 20s or 30s era cars and that kind of thing with Tommy guns and all that kind of stuff. And in fact, there's a really fascinating film. If you end up with the time to watch a film on Netflix or whatever while you're doing your social distancing, there's a film by an Indian director called Macbool, Maqbool, which I've written about a little bit, which is an adaptation of Macbeth into a kind of South Asian Indian context. You have to watch it with subtitles unless you can speak Hindi, but it's also a really fascinating kind of adaptation, transformation of the play into a kind of a mob story and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's just some background stuff, some kind of formal kinds of stuff. Let me turn our attention to just some context and background, just for understanding, making sure that we get, like what's kind of at stake in this play. And so I've got 5 things I want to mention here under point 2, and then I'll take a very short break and we'll move on to, section 2 of the lecture. Okay, so 5 things to say here. First, this is the first Jacobean play that we're encountering this semester. Queen Elizabeth dies in 1603. She is succeeded by there in the end there is not a civil war in England, as had been at least a possibility in the late 1590s when there was. I mean, she was unmarried. She was the last of the Tudors. She didn't have any children. What was going to happen to the throne when she died? Her cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, who's also dead at this point, but Mary Queen of Scots' son is a guy called James VI of Scotland, and he becomes the new king of England in 1603. So this is a Jacobean play, so it's written with a different kind of monarch in place. King James is he's a family man. He's married. He's got multiple children. The idea that the succession is going to be straightforward now is definitely. I mean, there's a lot less anxiety about. I mean, he's a man, not a woman, so there's not the gendered aspect of fear about what's going on with a woman being in charge. He's got a family, so like the succession is nice and clear. So there's lots of positive things that happen with the rise of King James. One of the other things that he does is he tries to bring together all of the people on the island of Great Britain under one nation, and he's unsuccessful in this ultimately. Right? He's the king of Scotland, he's the king of England, and he's the king of Wales. But he's never able to write the laws or get the laws passed that would make this all fit together legally, right? He just happens to have inherited a bunch of crowns. One of the things that he does is he takes Shakespeare's theater company under his patronage. So what used to be the Lord Chamberlain's men now becomes the King's men. And Shakespeare, he'd already been performing, or his company had been performing at court, but now they're sort of seen as the kind of the King's men, right? I mean, he writes for King James. The other company, that Lord Admiral's men, becomes the Queen's men, and there's a couple of other theater companies that come along as well, the Prince's men and that kind of thing. So there's just the 1603 marks a shift in terms of just the politics that are out there, kind of outside of and certainly penetrating into the theater. Second, this play, so this is point B under point 2, this is a Scottish history, which would have been less interesting. I mean, there were plays about Scotland in Elizabethan England, but it becomes more pointed because you've got you've got the King of Scotland is now also the King of England. I'm feeling a little backlit here, so I'm gonna... Yeah, okay. So you've got, so it's a Scottish history. Now Shakespeare gets his information, or he gets his version of things, or his starting point with this from Holinshed, right? Holinshed, that source that was so important for Richard II and 1 Henry IV, and for all of Shakespeare's history plays. Holinshed also writes a history of Scotland and a history of Ireland, and Shakespeare draws on Holinshed for his history of Macbeth, Macbeth is a historic figure in medieval Scotland. So you could think of this as, what's the difference between this play and Richard II or 1 Henry IV, right? These are British histories, British medieval histories. But again, we for various reasons, we kind of separate them out and say this is definitely a tragedy, unlike, say, Richard II, which we see as an English history. I think that's kind of an artificial distinction in some level, but in any case, this is a Scottish tragedy, right? Also, and I'll just mention that there's a theatrical context, by the way, in which you're not supposed to say the name, right? Macbeth itself, that word is supposed to be cursed. When you talk to theater people, they will sometimes refuse to say the word. They'll say, "Oh, the Scottish play." Because they don't want to. I mean, there's this long tradition of that having a kind of haunted aspect to it, particularly around theater people. Anyway, it's a Scottish history. Although what's one thing that's significant about it is that Shakespeare picks a moment where England and Scotland, medieval England and medieval Scotland, are in an important kind of contact point, and you can see that particularly later in the play. So I'm not going to get too much into it now, but as we move forward in the play, you'll see that the English end up playing a kind of more significant role in the play in various kinds of ways. Point 3. This is a play that picks up on King James's own preoccupations, the things that were interesting to him. He was interested in the idea of the supernatural and of witchcraft and things like this. He actually writes a book called Demonology, which is about like how to understand what supernatural stuff is all about and how to kind of show where it's all, some of it's a bunch of hooey and whatever. But I mean, he really is interested in that question of like what constitutes contact with the dark arts and all this other kind of stuff. And not that he is practicing it, but that he's like trying to diagnose it and moralize about it and that kind of thing. Anyway, so he's got a book about this subject, and so writing a play in which witches appear, seems like it's bound to appeal to King James as well. Point 4. There's an important event that happens just before Shakespeare writes this play. So in 1605, King James was getting ready to call his Parliament. The Catholics in England were unhappy with how King James was running things. They had this kind of, because his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had been Catholic, the Catholics in England had some hope that maybe James would be more tolerant, ecumenical about the Catholics, who were, anti-Protestant and all that kind of stuff. And he didn't seem to be fulfilling that promise. And so a bunch of Catholics get very kind of agitated about this, and there's a plot to assassinate King James. It's called the Gunpowder Plot. It happens in 1605. If you've ever heard of Guy Fawkes Day, Julie is smiling and laughing because basically the equivalent of the 4th of July for us is November the 5th, Guy Fawkes Day in England, when they do bonfires and they burn this guy Guy Fawkes in effigy and that kind of stuff. Anyway, so Guy Fawkes and a bunch of other Catholic conspirators, egged on and assisted by some Catholic Jesuits, some English Jesuit Catholics, they have this plan. There's whether or not it's actually genuine is a whole other story. But in any case, they are supposed to have put a whole bunch of barrels of gunpowder under the Houses of Parliament, and they were waiting for King James to do the kind of ceremonial opening of Parliament in 1605, and then they were going to light the fuse and blow up Parliament, kill King James, kill the Parliament, and basically do a coup. This was planned in 1605, and it was miraculously maybe averted when word got to the wrong person who got it to the right person, blah blah blah, and eventually the plot gets foiled, and so a bunch of these conspirators get, including the ringleader, this guy Guy Fawkes, they get arrested, they get tortured, and then they all get executed, and that happens shortly before this play. And so one of the ways of kind of it's hard to date this play, and we'll talk about that in just one second, but one of the ways to date, at least the earliest that this play could be, would be 1606, because it makes a bunch of references to things that happened in 1605 and 1606, this gunpowder plot and so on. And then finally, as I was saying, it's hard to date this play because the text that we have, and this is my last point 5 under number 2, the text of this play is not great. If you read the note on the text in our edition, Stephen Orgel talks a little bit about the complexities of this. There's so basically, the play doesn't get printed during, while Shakespeare's alive. There's no quarto version of it. Like we were talking about with Richard II, like we were talking about with 1 Henry IV, these are plays that are printed in Shakespeare's lifetime. And the fact that we can see different stages of that Richard II, for instance, kind of shows the possibilities of censorship and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, Macbeth doesn't get printed in one of those small editions in Shakespeare's lifetime. The first time the text gets printed is in that large, massive first folio of 1623. And I've talked about that book as being a very important one, right? That it has about half of the plays that we associate with Shakespeare are plays that only appear in the first folio, right? And if we didn't have the first folio, presumably we might have lost about half of the texts that we associate with Shakespeare. Anyway, so Macbeth shows up in the 1623 folio, but the text that's printed in the folio has at least one basically 1.5 scenes that had already been printed in a text by a different playwright called Thomas Middleton. Thomas Middleton, who writes in the same company as Shakespeare, writes a play called The Witch, which is it's a play that's just full of witchcraft, and it's kind of comedic in a lot of ways and so on. And that play is printed in before 1623, and then in Shakespeare's Macbeth, you see a scene that is in The Witch. And so basically what the theory goes that at some point, so Shakespeare writes the play, it's in what we call the playbook, right? The handwritten version of the text is sitting in the Globe in the theater, and they bring it out every once in a while. Sometimes they do court performances of it or whatever. They're doing these performances of it, and the play gets adapted and changes and so on. Over the course of between 1606, let's say, and 1623, that presumably it gets revived at various times, and when it gets revived, new stuff gets added, stuff gets taken out, and so on, and that at some point, someone at the theater thought, oh, those scenes that Middleton wrote, those are actually pretty good. Let's stick those in here for the witchcraft bits. So when you get to Shakespeare's play in 1623, there's definitely an overlay of someone else's contributions in the play, and it's basically impossible to untangle what, how much, it's not impossible, right? But it's very murky about what exactly has happened here. And then what Orgel mentions in his text in his edition here is that there is this other handwritten manuscript from the 1660s, which may point to the earliest manuscript, and so there might be a way to kind of untangle at least some of what Middleton contributed, but it's still, there are still some kind of gray areas basically. And so even our edition here, when you get to some of those witchcraft scenes, make sure you look at the footnotes. You'll see Orgel saying this part was a Middleton edition and so on, and that's just, and partly the thing is that because of the kind of bardomania, the worship of Shakespeare as this kind of great figure, anything that Shakespeare might have had been associated with was just always kind of assumed to be Shakespeare. And so there's a long tradition of those bits being associated with Shakespeare and not with Middleton. And so you kind of can't take them out of an edition without upsetting some people who expect to see these kind of humorous witchcraft scenes in there. So, Orgel's going to include them. He just wants to call our attention to the fact that at least some of this is probably not by Shakespeare. Anyway, one of the things is that as a result, it makes it hard to date the play for sure, right? We know that it has to have been written after 1606, but it might be 1607, might be 1608. Anyway, okay,